But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast. I'm your host, Richie Singh, and today we explore the nation-building efforts of Sir John A. MacDonald. After his re-election in 1878, he introduced a national policy to unify and strengthen Canada through protective tariffs, railway expansion, and strategic immigration. These initiatives spurred industrial growth, connected the country via the CPR, and populated the western provinces with European settlers. However, this progress came at a significant cost to Indigenous peoples. We'll discuss the displacement caused by settlement policies, the introduction of the Indian Act, and the residential school system, which aimed to assimilate Indigenous children and suppress their culture. Join us as we delve into the complex legacy of MacDonald's policies, exploring both economic development they fueled and the lasting challenges they created for Indigenous community. This is History in Motion.
Welcome back, everyone, as we roll it back to our very, very first leader and Sir John A. MacDonald. And so when we started this podcast, I think honestly, the conversation between us, Richie, was, hey, who should we start with? And we both looked at each other and said, as Canadians, I don't know enough about our first prime minister. We should research some more about him. And I think we learned a ton about him in the first episode that we did around the Pacific scandal and his life and kind of bringing together Canada as a nation. So I think it was a kind of a really great episode. And then we ended off and we were like, wait, there's a whole other piece to his life around not only 5 more majorities, something like that, plus all of the Indigenous relations that he had as Canada started to move westward. So today we're going to focus on that part of his life, but don't worry, you don't have to go back and listen to the first episode. That was way back. I like to think we've improved since then. So we'll do a little bit of a recap on the first episode, and then we'll go into talking about the rest of his life with a focus around his relationships with Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Like we were saying offline before we, hit record, there is so much content about Sir John A.'s life that, the hour-ish that we're going to talk about it, we're obviously going to try our best to do it justice. But I think for our listeners, it's really important to understand how long he actually served as prime minister. Spoiler alert, he actually passed away in office. Right. So there is so much content here. And I think to your point, Paul, like in our very first episode, we focused on his early life and career, his political beginnings, some discussion around Confederation. It's almost heresy to talk about early Canadian history without talking about railways. So obviously the CPR was front and center. And then we kind of finished off with the Pacific scandal and his, where we're going to kind of pick up today, which is his political comeback.
Yeah. And I think we walked away from that first episode kind of almost, I would say I was pretty impressed by Sir John A. MacDonald. I walked away from it saying, hey, this is a man who is able to see the nuances between really two separate worlds in the English and French sides of Canada and found a way to bring them in with sufficient compromises and bring in provinces like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, bring them into Confederation. And people really respected him. People really wanted to work with him. And then on top of that, we found out that he was a massive drunk all the time. And he was, showing up late to meetings because he was drinking. But then people were like, well, he's so good at what he does, we'll kind of let that slide. And so you just kind of saw this mix and, his son dying young and on all of these sort of things. I think we were able to kind of really see the human side of his life versus just, passing this policy and that act and all the things that he did. So yeah, I came away pretty kind of impressed, but I know when you read a kind of a biography about Sir John A. MacDonald and even kind of look around some of the discourse today, it's not so much the first part of his life that people criticize him for. It's kind of that second act that we're going to talk about today. And like we mentioned before, this is a really difficult one to research just because it is such a hot topic politically, unfortunately, right now. And so I think the history gets lost in, how people are feeling about certain situations. So I think we're going to do our best today to try to keep it as neutral as we can, because there is a lot here, but it definitely is kind of something that's kind of rising to the surface, in recent years.
Yeah, 100%. I'll reiterate that. I think many of his detractors in, the modern day, and many of them justified in terms of some of the policies and legislative moves that he made, definitely struck at the heart of Indigenous communities. There's really no way around it. But again, our job here is to try our best to present the facts with as much nuance as we can and provide people with a very holistic view.
Absolutely. And I think as Canadians, we learn more and more about, how the residential school system was such a disaster in Canada and on all the hardships and everything that came around that. But I always walked away from hearing about that and hearing how Sir John A. Macdonald's cabinet was involved. And I always walked away saying, how can a man that we've studied in the first episode, who was clearly so brilliant and so good at unifying and building a nation, have such a colossal blunder? Was this just bad facts, bad execution, or was he just like, we need to destroy this Indigenous population in some capacity, culturally or whatever it might be? And we see those headlines around, genocidal and those sort of things. I want to know a little bit more about what the heck actually happened here, because it didn't really line up for me. And so I think that's what's going to be interesting about today is, how does he fit into a world where Canada's building itself as a country? Indigenous people, like we've talked about over the last 2 episodes, they don't know where they're going to live in this world. Smallpox is killing off a lot of people. And now we have famine and war and all these sort of things are coming together. How does Sir John A. Macdonald come into this? And was there the opportunity to really fix this problem? Or was he just dealt one of the worst hands that you could possibly have and there was nothing he could do? The answer is usually somewhere in the middle, but I think that's what we're going to try to find out today.
Yeah, I think that with that, we'll just start off with a bit of a recap where we left off in, way back when in our very first episode. Sir John A. kind of emerges as this very towering, powerful figure who's seen and, most commonly known for his ability in uniting the provinces into a single nation, Canada, in 1867. His vision for the country was very ambitious and far-reaching. He recognized that to forge a strong, cohesive nation, significant infrastructure projects were essential, and nothing was more significant than the transcontinental railway that would bind the disparate regions of Canada from coast to coast. So this is the CPR, or the Canadian Pacific Railway, conceived as this monumental nation-building project, which was integral to the economic development and national unity of Canada. Essentially, in his vision, it was to connect the fertile lands of the East with the rugged, untamed wilderness of the West, particularly British Columbia, which only agreed to join the Confederation on the promise of a railway linking it to the rest of the country.
And I think that's an important point, and we talked about it in episode 1, is it's not a foregone conclusion that, modern day Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia were going to be part of Canada. They were semi-independent in some capacity. Some of this land was, like you said, almost untamed wilderness where you may have had some small Indigenous groups living there, but it really wasn't governed by a central body. And the United States is expanding west, and like I said, we take it for granted that 49th parallel is the line where Canada and the U.S. separate, but that wasn't the case back then. British Columbia could easily have joined the United States if it didn't get what it wanted. May have been a foregone conclusion, but again, back then, they're worried about this kind of stuff. They know they need to try to connect these two parts of, what would become Canada, because it's not just going to happen overnight. And like you were saying, like linking them with a railway, bringing that economic opportunity and just being able to move people back and forth was really that glue, I think, that brought those provinces together.
It's such a good point, because in the podcast that you had shared, Paul, we can put a link to it afterwards because it was really well done. There was kind of this framing that really stuck with me, and I think I'll summarize it well when I finish the recap, but it's almost like 3 different worlds he's trying to contend with, right? There's Eastern Canada, Central Canada, Western Canada, and then you have this behemoth to the south that's also going to expand. And it was mentioned in that podcast that, expansion westward wasn't really something that Sir John A. wanted to tackle immediately in the imminent future. He wanted to give it a couple decades, but he had this imminent threat down south that, was wreaking havoc and expanding westward, and in all likelihood could extend north as well. So, this is the kind of world that he's living in and making these very strategic, complex decisions. And that's why the railroad was so, important to him and to Canada as a whole in this kind of uniting front. But obviously, this was a massive undertaking from an infrastructure perspective. There was obviously a lot of political tension and, monetary requirements. So Macdonald's leadership, his kind of compatriots, they sought funding for the railway's construction to ensure that they had the necessary capital capital, they turned to a gentleman named Sir Hugh Allen, who was a prominent Canadian businessman who had substantial financial resources. However, there was a bit of a clandestine agreement made between the two parties where, Sir Allen would give him the funds, but then his consortium of builders, railwaymen would actually help build the CPR. So this came to light, the revelation of these bribes and the subsequent scandal kind of struck at the very heart of MacDonald's government, kind of cast this very wide-ranging shadow over his leadership and his integrity. In 1873, he actually resigned as prime minister, marking a very, dramatic end to his first term in office. And, it severely, at least at this point in time, tarnished his personal reputation. But, we'll see that in the not too distant future, he kind of redeems himself. So in many cases, the Pacific scandal remains this kind of very significant chapter in Canadian history. You see political corruption, you see the nation building process, the impact of, transparency and integrity in public life. And it just, again, it reminds us of the world that he's trying to really, build Canada within.
Yeah, I think with that bribe too, I remember us kind of talking about it and we were like, why? What was the point of it? Like, I still don't really understand to this day. Like, again, we think of today, political parties have a ton of money. They're always looking for donations and that kind of stuff. Maybe this is just some old fashioned corruption that happens more than we think. And it got blown out of proportion or blown into the correct proportion, but just everyone saw it in broad daylight. But yeah, I think I remember us kind of talking about, when he left office, a lot of the leadership in the Conservative Party were like, we kind of need you back. And eventually we'll see how he comes back. But even to your point too, around him saying, hey, the West is the West. Let's give it some time. Maybe I think I saw a quote. He said something about like 50 years. He was almost willing to wait until it was time to start moving westward. And again, like it makes total sense, right? You've just brought in 4 provinces who are all very different, speaking different languages. You definitely have religious elements too that you need to contend with. Some stability in that side of the country is probably the most paramount thing, especially when we see what happens to Canada's economy in the late 1800s, because he's throwing high tariffs and all these things on a lot of things coming from the US, and Canada's really struggling to compete. So yeah, what do you really need to expand west to an area where you're going to have to spend a lot of money to police it and send the army out and have settlers move west? Like, does it really make sense? But you're right, the threat of U.S. expansion into that territory means almost whoever gets there first is probably going to take it. So yeah, I think that kind of spurs hey, we got to get moving and we got to do it with a railway.
Yep. And I think when I think about this particular chunk of his life, if I'm trying to sequence it into kind of like logical chunks, the theme of nation building and expansion and population, to kind of actually bring people in and bring populations to those more disparate far reaches of the Canadian of Western Canada at that point in time. Those are kind of the things that really stick out to me.
Definitely. And I think when you talk about population, this might be a good segue for us to talk about, there's one group we really haven't discussed where their role is in Confederation and Canada becoming the country. And that is the Indigenous population of Canada. So when approaching, I would say, Confederation in the late 1850s, and something that I found was really interesting in what we considered Eastern Canada at the time. So you're talking about Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. There's only about 15,000 First Nations, or as they called it back then, Indian people living within that space, which was about like a fraction of a percent of the 2 million people that lived in this space ended up becoming Canada. So this is not even just a minority, but like a sliver of the amount of people that are in the country. And so when it comes to Confederation, they weren't given a voice. They weren't given the opportunity to say, hey, we want to be governed in this way. And part of that is because their numbers were just so small. And it would have been, and I can see kind of when you look at the leaders of the country probably saying, oh, how do we work with the English? How do we work with the French? How do we work with, Irish immigrants coming in? You have this native group who, we'll get into why, they're not having the most amount of respect, but also they are such a small group. At the end of the day, what power are they going to have? What voting power are they going to have? Even when they protest, it's not going to be enough people. And so, you're really starting from a place where you're kind of seen as this like small little footnote, in kind of the grander nation making process.
That's a really good point, right? I think when we're trying to do an episode like this and we're trying to be as nuanced as possible, those types of details really do add so much merit and value to the scope of things, right? Marginalized communities, they have typically always had very small voices because they're usually, quieted down by the much more larger, more vocalized majority groups. And we're talking about French Canadians at this time, Eastern Canadians. It's a tough spot to be in when you're trying to find yourself in your place in what Canada looks like. And this is just one small group amongst multiple other competing groups that are trying to vie for the same thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Everybody's got their, this is what we need, this is what we want. And if you're, a small minority, right, it can get really, really tricky. So from that 15,000, though, there are over 175,000 Indigenous and Métis people living in what is considered Western Canada. So we have to think Canada is built around the French and English sides of the country coming together. The laws are kind of thinking about that. And like we mentioned, the Indigenous population are just kind of shoved to the side and not really thought about because they're so small and for other reasons we'll get into. But then when we start to move west, the First Nations and Métis people now become a majority. They become a very large chunk of this population. And so how do you build a nation that's going to change this quickly? And that's the challenge I think Sir John A. Macdonald has as we get into this is how does he contend with, bringing in a third ethnic group that is not only different in the sense that, they're not French or English, but they're not coming from, a European background. They're not Christian. They're hunter-gatherers in a lot of situations. They're not setting up cities and farming like we're seeing in Eastern Canada. How do you deal with a lot of that? And we'll see how it's a struggle for Canada to really come together and figure out how they're going to solve this problem.
Yeah, that's a huge problem to contend with. And I think, again, it kind of goes back to that original framing I brought up. It's like three different worlds he's trying to figure out at the same time to be able to unify Canada in a meaningful way. And you have this chasm, as big as the Grand Canyon, if not larger, between how these kind of groups are governing themselves. And if the goal is to expand westward, culturally, economically, you're kind of at odds.
Yeah, it's just a tricky spot. Like, how can you, and especially too with how much effort is being put on stabilizing the original country of Canada. And as you start to expand west, how do you find the right amount of resources to move around? And I think you add to the sentiment of the day. I have a quote here from someone named Stanford Fleming, who wrote in his diary in 1845, so about 20 years before Canada became a country, referencing the Indigenous population of Canada. He said, they are dying away every year, and it is suppose their race will soon be extinct. Because not only, smallpox and war and famine and all of these things are starting to really chip away at these Indigenous communities. There was kind of this sentiment of either they are going to physically die off or their culture is going to die off and they are going to be, intermarry with Europeans or just kind of get, quote unquote, assimilated into this British way, French way of life. It's almost like it's something we don't have to worry about anymore. But as we'll see, that's definitely not what happens. But one of the most important things that's happening at this time is there's widespread famine happening for decades while Sir John A. Macdonald is in power. And really that's well documented about the decline of bison population or buffalo population. So it is estimated that in the Northern Plains, so think of like Western Canada, but also Northern United States, Montana, Dakotas, those kind of places. There's bison herds going back and forth across the quote unquote border. And, they say there was probably about 5 to 6 million bison in the early 19th century, so early 1800s. And by the 1860s, about 2/3 of those animals were gone. So for a lot of reasons we're a lot of overhunting and kind of industrializing the hunting of buffalo for hides and all of these sort of other things. And so for groups that rely on the buffalo population, following the herds, hunter-gatherer societies, as the buffalo starts to dwindle, there's no fallback. There's no, we'll go hunt something else. That'll work for a little bit, but there's a reason they were hunting the buffalo to begin with. And as it starts to die away, it gets trickier and trickier for these Indigenous groups to function and let alone feed themselves, as their way of life is slowly dying away.
So what kind of strikes me in that analysis is that, I guess it's two parts. One being just the massive shift in the Indigenous way of life that's happening in the western part of this continent. I know we're focused on Canada, but it's a great point about the back and forth that's happening across this supposed border, quote unquote, at this time, at least. And secondly, how much of this is either intentional with like bison farming or bison killing, and or how is this an opportunistic approach that could leverage or enable what Sir John A. wants to do with the westward expansion, right? I think those are some very calculated questions that he's probably thinking of, especially when he comes back, just given, our last episode on Louis Riel and the tensions that are arising there between, the US to the south and Canada, or what is Canada, and just what's going on internally within those Indigenous groups.
Yeah, it's going to be a shift in multiple different areas, and we'll see the struggles that come into it. But you're right, like how opportunistic can someone be here versus when does this turn into a crisis? And I think, as we'll see, it turns into a crisis more than any sort of opportunity, I think, especially for the Canadian government, because now you've brought these people into your country, you're trying to govern them, and now they're starving to death. You have an obligation to make sure that you can fix this problem. And so I'm going to go through actually just a bunch of different years here, but it all kind of encapsulates the famine that's really happening at this point and just how dire of a situation it was for a lot of Indigenous groups in the West. So in 1873, a doctor who was the director of the Geological Survey of Canada reported that discontent and uneasiness at present prevailing amongst the Indians is almost entirely a question of the future supply of food. The extermination of the buffalo means starvation and death. And so you continue to see this theme. There was a commissioner who went out west and he said, I'm alarmed when I look at the buffalo. It appears to me that there is only one. So he's going west, he's hearing about these great buffalo herds and he sees them and there's usually one by itself. And there's this thing of, okay, we got to do something here. And that's what happens. The government finally gets their act together and says, okay, the buffalo is dying off at an alarming rate. If we don't do something today, they're going to go extinct. Our native populations are going to die off. They're going to starve to death. We don't know how to fix this problem. So they bring in some hunting regulations in 1879, which immediately has a ton of pushback in Indigenous communities because they don't want to be governed by the Canadian government. They want to keep their way of life. They want to self-identify and basically come back to the government and say, okay, look, this is our way of life. We're going to keep hunting buffalo. We're not going to listen to what you guys have to say. But the government of Canada is saying, well, they're going to die off anyways. And then there's kind of this, well, that's not our problem. And it kind of goes back and forth. And when you're fighting for survival, I don't really blame the Indigenous communities because they're like, this is our way of life. How else are we supposed to live if you tell us we can't hunt buffalo? Our people are going to starve to death. And that actually does start to happen. So, this is what MacDonald basically has to deal with for a huge chunk of his later leadership runs is just this decline in Indigenous populations due to starvation. There's a report that between 1880 and 1885, the population of the Plains First Nations dropped from 32,000 to 20,000 just based on the fact that, so many people were dying. There's a quote here saying somebody who went out west in 1883 in the winter, he was a Catholic missionary, and he reported that he saw a gauntlet of children dying of hunger. Although it was 30 to 40 degrees below zero, their bodies were basically covered with, torn rags, nothing. So not only are these kids starving to death, they don't even have proper winter clothing and all that, because a lot of that still comes from, you kill a buffalo, you don't throw the hide in the garbage, you sell it or you use it for warmth, right? And now you're not able to replenish what you need, or it's being sold at such a high price. And we talked about the fur trade last week. This is just, again, smallpox, people moving into your territory. All of these things are piling up. And then you slap on top of this that your entire essentially source of food and clothing and basically anything you need for the essentials of life is dying off in front of your eyes. It just makes for a horrendous situation for everybody involved.
Yeah. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway, right? Like understanding the lived experience of the Indigenous communities in that part of Canada at the time. Because I think it really does just not necessarily like re-emphasize, but then also, where this conversation is ultimately going to lead, how fraught those tensions became and, what ultimately became of them with more and more governorship and government oversight.
Absolutely. Right. And this is not like it's so far gone that Indigenous communities don't remember, the good old days when they could live the life that they knew and remembered. And as their civilization grew and evolved, it was big open swaths of land, a lot of hunting, fishing, keeping those tight knit communities around and being able to defend themselves against other Indigenous groups based on the fact that they didn't have such a technological advantage over one of each other. It worked in that sense because it was familiar. And I think the other thing that, as I'm kind of talking here and realizing, is all these things are happening, but it's the rate that they're happening at. Not only is it the buffaloes are dying off, and that happened over 100-year span. Like this is happening within decades. And this is happening with, the movement of Western expansion. This is all happening so fast. It's not only a physical trauma that is, being thrown at these Indigenous groups. It's like, I can only imagine the mental and just emotional strain, even if you had enough food to eat and you weren't worried about your land going away, but like what could happen tomorrow because you heard about another group, I can only imagine living at this time because it's unfathomable to think about being in this spot and, hearing your grandfather talk about, when before the Europeans came, We had enough food. We had a village that was 5 times the size of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it kind of tears at your heart a little bit.
100%. I think, a thought came to mind, and I'm going to try to word this very carefully. It almost seems like they were at a high level, like victims of quote unquote progress, because progress really would depend on who's defining it. And in this case, it's going to be this kind of European ideal of progress and what that means. And I think this is probably a good segue back to Sir John A. So at this point, we're talking about the late 1870s, early 1880s, this kind of period of like consolidating this nation building project, continuing expansion. And this is after MacDonald comes back in 1878 and wins the election, returns him to power as prime minister. One of the first things he did was introduce the national policy. And I think this is really important because it kind of gets to the more tactical side of how he's going to try to actually deal with the problems that are facing Canada on a whole. So, there's the economic side, which is him implementing very strict protective tariffs to protect emerging Canadian industries from foreign competition. So these are high tariffs being imposed on imported manufactured goods. The goal was to shelter Canadian manufacturers from cheaper American imports and kind of nurture and develop this self-sufficient industrial base in Canada. Obviously, there's a railway expansion. And I think I'll probably couple these two a little bit, which is also immigration. So you have, I think, we have not understated the importance of the CPR in any way in any of our episodes about Canadian history. It's so important because it's going to promote economic development and national unity, right? These are the two very massive goals of this railway expansion. But if you're talking about national unity, and you're talking about Western Canada, which, Paul, I'm glad you brought up the demographic data about, how many Indigenous people are in Western Canada at the time. This brings the question of immigration to the forefront for Sir John A. So how are we going to populate these Western territories and support economic expansion? If you're unable to kind of get the Indigenous groups involved and get buy-in to kind of support what his vision of economic expansion looks like, then you're going to have to populate it with people who kind of fit that idea of progress, values, and what they're trying to accomplish. And again, there's this goal of bringing in, European immigrants, specifically from the UK, to support this economic expansion. But it's also to secure Canadian sovereignty over this kind of vast Western region by establishing these settled these settled immigrants. And he does this, the government does this through like incentives like cheap land, faster immigration, all these kind of add-ons and additional wins to actually making the decision to populate, Western Canada, which is, like we said earlier, kind of untamed at this point.
Yeah, I think we forget too, Canada is a country, but it is still subservient to the British Crown. And for lack of a better term, almost a colony of, not in the traditional sense, but, laws still have to get passed through the British government and that sort of things. They have obviously a lot more autonomy, but to your point, right, in the eyes of the Canadian government, and you're settling someone in the West who's from the UK, a British citizen, that's almost as good as putting a Canadian citizen there, because they're going to be loyal to the British Crown. They're not going to be American or, in their eyes, Indigenous people who are trying to just create something new and hold on to what they have left. And eventually you can start to build up that majority. But even as we talked about last week with Louis Riel, right, there is now still a massive chunk of Indigenous and Métis people living in this space. And that clashing is going to start, right? As you start to push these people west and the Indigenous people are kind of putting their feet in the ground saying, okay, you've settled all these people from the UK here and they're trying to have their own say. There's always going to be some friction. And I think where we talked about Louis Riel is there was two ways it was kind of going. There was the peaceful way where delegates going to Ottawa talking about what's going to happen. And then you have the situations where, hey, the people in Saskatchewan are starving and we're not getting the support we need from the government. So we're going to get violent until we get what we want. And I think this whole story really comes around what's the response to a lot of that stuff, because I think it's really going to drive that. And I think to your point around these immigrants coming in and the push of how do we get more of them west to really solidify Canadian interests there is really what's going to, I think, guide the rest of this story as we talk about what the government does next, whatever they're trying to do and get the Indigenous people, to become part of Canada and in their eyes, more kind of on board, I guess is the best way I can put it.
Yeah. And I think, there's kind of two sides of a very similar coin here, whereas you want to populate the western part of Canada with these European immigrants from the UK. So there's kind of this homogeneity of people who kind of think alike, look alike. But on the other side of that coin is, how do you get the Indigenous communities to, I'm going to use the word assimilate because I think we're going to start using it pretty quickly now, into Canadian society, or what his vision of Canadian society actually looks like. And that's where you start seeing policies coming into play, residential schools, this kind of forced assimilation. And it gets dark pretty quick.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm just kind of reading here, we had talked about it offline about the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 of this, how are we going to gradually bring the Indigenous people into Canada and then quote unquote enfranchise them and bring them as full citizens. And now I think we have to put ourselves in the head of a upper class British subject at this point in time. Being a citizen of the British Empire in their eyes is the greatest thing that can happen to a non-British person. This is like, in their eyes, they're like, we're going to be giving the Indigenous people the ability, like almost to apply to be, as long as they fulfill certain things, to become British citizens. What more could anybody ever want? What a great honor. And that's the way a lot of people are thinking at this time, because there's definitely, the British Empire is maybe not at its peak, but pretty close to its peak in terms of size and power at this point in time. Napoleon's only defeated, 40, 50 years earlier. Sir John A. MacDonald's born during the time of just after Napoleon's defeated. So like there's this huge shift in power to the British side of the world. And that's the way they see it, right? And remember, just kind of going back when we talked about ancient Rome a lot, was Roman citizenship was huge, and people would actually go to war to get Roman citizenship. And then the British are looking at it no differently. They're saying like, you should be fighting us to get citizenship, and we're giving it to you voluntarily as long as you fulfill, a few of what we decide versus, around giving up some of your culture and language things and learning skills and, a bunch of things that we'll get to. But that's just the mentality of this world, right? Is being a British citizen. What more could anybody ever want? Yeah.
It's these conversations are like the other examples of like enfranchisement, essentially, is what it is, right? I got a little curious about what this actually meant. So I'll read this little snippet that I came across. So to meet this criteria, Indigenous men were to be judged on their education, on their level of indebtedness and good moral character, and could apply to become enfranchised. And after a 3-year trial period, they would either be, given the rights or not. And that status, if granted, would give them voting rights, full status as British subjects, and ownership of a plot of land, 20 hectares from their reserve.
I always love like all of that kind of seemed right. Like, yeah, you don't come in with a lot of debt. There's some language requirements, but you're in good character and good standing. They always love to throw that in because it gets so subjective, where it's like you can throw anybody out for any reason because you don't quote unquote like their character.
Exactly.
But I bet you too, for a lot of Indigenous people, right at this time, you're struggling with food, you're seeing your civilization collapse around you. You may start to be looking at the way British life, and I'm sure there was some Indigenous people who were like, "Hey, I think this is the sign of the times. I'm going to jump on board." And I'm sure it worked out for some people, but at the same time, right? And this is a way to start pulling apart communities, slowly chipping away at it to get to the point of like people who are really dug in and saying, I'm not going to do it. Well, what are you going to do now? Half your village has decided that they're leaving the reserve and they're going to go live on some new land that they just got given to them by the government. And they're starting to, farm and do all these sort of things. And they're doing quite well. It's just, again, if your goal is to strip away any Indigenous way of life and amalgamate it into quote unquote Canadian/British European way of thinking, it's not a bad strategy to do it. But at the same time, you're losing part of what kind of makes Canada, Canada, right? Is you have this third group that you can either destroy or you can try to bring into what you've created. And they seem to go for the, maybe not directly destroy it, but slowly chip away at it until with the thought that, yeah, it's eventually going to die out anyways. And then we'll just have kind of this English and French sides of Canada and we move on.
Yeah, I think that's that's a really good way of looking at it. And the way that I would kind of see it, as you were speaking, like two things came to mind. One, I think you brought up a good example of, there's got to be some minority in these Indigenous communities that are thinking, maybe this is the right thing for me, myself, and my family. And I think that's an important takeaway, because I think historically it's really easy to look at communities, countries even, as like kind of monoliths. And I know with Indigenous communities, there's a real, like ease of looking at their communities as a monolith and just kind of grouping them as Indigenous groups. And then, we know that's like totally erroneous because they have, such division amongst that broad grouping of Indigenous communities with their own cultural ways of life, language, cultural activities and events. But even on like a layer lower than that, at a personal level, they're seeing the world changing, outside of what tribe you're in. It really does kind of beg the question around, what are they thinking at this kind of human level, aside from their actual tribal commitments or communal agreements with their Indigenous families and groups. And the second thing, that this idea of kind of chipping away at it, this seems to be, like the carrot and the stick almost, in a way, right? Like there's a choice here that, we're presenting you with this great opportunity that you could take. And, that's kind of the first stage in this like assimilation project. But eventually that stick and carrot approach can only get you so far.
Yeah, you're right. And at top of that, right, there's the stakes are rising. Louis Riel's rebelling in the West. Yep. People are dying. We got to do something, right? And so I think this is a good transition into the residential school side of things. So like we mentioned before, we look back in 2024 at how the residential school program worked. Complete disaster, stripped away the civilization of a lot of Indigenous people being forced from their homes to go to these schools, living in some terrible conditions. But like I mentioned at the beginning of this, what was the intent of this? Why did they think this was a good idea? And so it all comes back to our good friends to the south. They started building things they called them industrial schools, basically. So the government of Canada asks a gentleman with the last name Davin, and he writes something called the Davin Report. And he basically goes to the US and he studies these schools. He talks to people involved with them. He talks to Indigenous groups. He talks to the government of the United States. And he tries to figure out, okay, is this working? What lessons can we take back to Canada? Because again, in their eyes, we have to do something to the Indigenous groups. One is they are under a lot of the treaties that have been signed. There is a guarantee to education. So the government is obligated by these treaties to build these schools and educate the Indigenous population like any other Canadian. However, they're not seeing it in the same way because they're going into a brand new culture who doesn't see education in the exact same way that the French and English side of Canada do. So in this report, he talks about, that's the duty of the government to afford all Indians reasonable aid in their preparation for citizenship. So that thing we talked about before, how do you get an Indigenous person to a point where they're, quote unquote, ready to become a British citizen? And there's two parts to that in this report. He says educating them in industry and the arts of civilization, which, I don't think it needs any explanation. The first part is, I think, where the majority of this report starts. And I kind of read it and I was like, this isn't so bad. I've heard that it's not the best, but there's definitely some 18th century thinking in there, but it wasn't too bad. It really has a focus on farming for the most part. But there are some points where they say, hey, look, in the US, they brought a lot of Indigenous kids to school, but they went home and all of the influences of the quote wigwam, which is basically, they're saying the Indigenous way of life would come back and they wouldn't be learning in the way that we wanted them to. So we need a stronger influence in the school. And that's why they're talking about these boarding schools where you actually take children from their villages or from their reserves and bring them into these schools where they live and work and do everything that they need to do to get educated. So he says the experience of the United States is the same as our own as far as an adult Indian is concerned. Little can be done with him, just telling him already to begin with. He can be taught to do a little at farming, stock raising, and to dress in a more civilized manner. But that is all. The child, again, who goes to a day school learns little, and what little he learns is soon forgotten. While his tastes are fashioned at home and his inherited aversion to toil is no way combated. So it's this whole thing about our way of life. And it's almost like this kind of indoctrination program. It sounds like a little bit too, is kind of how I would see it. But I will say, though, what they're actually planning to teach the people at these schools is actually it aligns with the challenges that Canada's facing and the US. The challenge is if you can't hunt buffalo anymore, you got to learn how to farm. And most Indigenous communities don't have the skills that the Europeans do to farm. So A, they can't compete and make a living for themselves. And B, they can't feed themselves because it's just, like we said, the shock of change. And so they say, yes, we're bringing these kids in the US. The boys are learning how to raise cattle and agriculture. The females are learning more traditional, sewing, bread making, and, things that would make them a good farmer's wife, as kind of you would look at traditional family back in those days. And so, that's really how it starts. And then he also mentions that there's some really good schools in the US that are actually training some of the, I guess, kind of like the top students and training them as interpreters. And then they're joining the US government and they're able to help work with these Indigenous communities on whatever they need to work on. And so he says, hey, there's some great results with these industrial schools. And he says the 5 quote unquote civilized nations of the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, the Creeks and the Seminoles are making great progress. And so he makes a little bit of a comment where he always kind of throws in this, yeah, but they got a bit of mix of European blood in there. So they're doing okay. The pure Indians, they're trying their best. And we'll start to see this kind of thought as we go along, and it gets a little nasty as it moves forward. But he does actually talk to Indigenous people who have gone to these schools and who are actually running these schools. And so there's a gentleman named Colonel Porter who's part European, part Indigenous, and he basically says, yeah, this has actually worked great for us. He goes, I went to one of these schools. I learned a ton. I understand now how to farm and all of these sort of things. And he goes, it got to the point where we all did so well at these schools that the government said, you know what, you guys are free to actually go run these schools yourselves. So the way the U.S. is kind of thinking of it is we'll bring in these Indigenous communities, these kids, help them learn farming and all of these skills and, Western civilization and what their world is. And then once they've kind of got to a point where they're self-sufficient, we can hand the schools back to them and, they can learn. And some Indigenous people are saying, hey, this worked out great for us. For me personally, this was great. However, not everybody thinks the same way. He goes on to kind of talk about this is discontent amongst Indian groups. He says it amounts to no more than the chronic quarrel of the Indian character, and the uneasiness about food at the time of the year will unfortunately leave no trace in their mind when the spring opens and fish are plentiful. So they're basically saying like, look, it really works well when the Indigenous groups are struggling with food. But then as soon as spring comes around and there's fish everywhere and there's game to hunt, they go, do I really need to learn farming? And so he's kind of saying, that's the way of life. And well, he's not saying it exactly. That's more my interpretation of it. Yeah. He's saying it in a much different way, but that's kind of the vibe, right? Is, we're trying to teach these Indigenous groups farming and, again, civilization, but they're consistently going back to kind of the old ways of doing things. And talks about too how, and again, this is a little bit, I think, again, painting the Indigenous groups with a monolith, but kind of says, they were used to living this unsettled life, following their game, moving around, more of a wild side of things where they're not sedentary in the way that the Eastern United States was. And, pulling people in and saying you have to farm the same land every day, all day. Some people are struggling to kind of make that jump. So that's kind of the first part of the report. And again, it wasn't great to begin with, but I can understand the thought around, hey, look, we're teaching Indigenous groups to farm. That's very important because they're dying out at alarming numbers. The buffalo are dying out at alarming numbers. But on the flip side, you also have this arts of civilization element to it, which we'll get into in a little bit. But you can start to see there's the practical side of things, the concrete hard skills versus some of the, how do you carry yourself? What religion do you believe in?
Yeah, exactly.
How do you dress? That parts that comes in that he doesn't really seem to be able to separate the two in this report. He kind of sees them as, kind of one and the same. And unfortunately, if you brought people in to just teach them how to farm and that was the end of it and everybody moved on with their lives, this probably would have worked out pretty well. Adding in that second piece, it almost seems like a foregone conclusion that they're not really willing to give up.
Yeah, I think there's like this, at least for me, and I'm curious to see if you agree with this, but there's this kind of ideal of paternalism and, I'd almost say superiority that's kind of undercutting all of this analysis. And is kind of coming up against this view, that example of, in the winter, it's all right because there's not much to do. But, inherently speaking, there's some kind of this, this inherent behavior in these Indigenous communities that when they're able to go back to their way of life, they always will choose that.
Yeah, I think that part, of people going back to what's familiar and what they're used to and what they've been doing for hundreds of years, I get it. And I think that's totally normal. And I think that's a fair analysis of what was going on, but it's more than that because I don't think it's, from what I've been reading here, I don't necessarily think it's, and this is like a terrible way of putting it, but it's almost like a step in the right direction from a really, really horrible racist thought about Indigenous people. It's almost like one step further of, okay, they're not bad people. It's not like their minds are toast and will never be able to whatever. They're good people, but we have to train them to be correct. And there's a path forward, and we can do that because, we're who we are and we feel our civilization is superior to theirs. Therefore, we can bring them into British citizenship and all of these things. It's still very gross, but somehow, again, it's not the worst it could have been. It's not King Leopold in the Congo where it's like, these are basically subhuman people who I'm going to treat as, slaves and start chopping hands off. This is, okay, we're not going to do that, but, your culture, that's got to go before we're ready to bring you into, quote unquote, unquote Western civilization.
Yeah. And I think that's what kind of came to mind when you're speaking. And I think maybe it's a good point to take it up a level. And, we're talking a lot about Sir John A, right? And we might be conflating that this is something that's like totally only aligned to him, but it's probably worthwhile mentioning the Indian Act. Which kind of is, what this kind of ultimately becomes. And a part of that, broader act is this kind of element of education. This was something that the Liberal government also wanted at the same time, right? This was kind of a bipartisan issue in which both parties were aligned. And the Indian Act was actually passed by the Liberal government, by Prime Minister Alexander Mackenzie and the Minister of the Interior. And it pretty much, created this very broad legislative relationship to govern over Indigenous peoples by the Canadian government, particularly those this is where the term status Indian comes from. And it essentially defined what that meant. It governed different bands of communities, land management of reserve lands. You have economic and social restrictions to a certain degree, prohibiting the sale of agricultural products off reserves without government permission, social control measures, essentially banning some cultural practices. And again, these are all kind of coming together with this symbiosis to ultimately, to do this gradual act of civilization, quote unquote. And education kind of undercuts all of it, because what I see it as almost is that you're going to target a generation which is typically more malleable and potentially being quote unquote civilized. I keep forgetting. I'm afraid to say civilized with using quote unquote, because I think it's such an ambiguous term, and this is audio. Yeah,
for sure. I think, obviously we know there's no civilizing that really needed to be done. This is just, we're trying to put ourselves in the shoes of Sir John A. Macdonald and the people around him. But even to your point too about the Indian Act, and there's talk in there about treaties and those sort of things. I did read too that the premiers of Ontario, and I don't know if it was the premier of British Columbia, but at least the government of British Columbia, they were both even more radical, saying, why do we even need not even an Indian Act, but why do we even need treaties? These people belong to Canada. They're going to be governed the way we want to govern them. What do we care, right? And so the federal government with Sir John A. Macdonald, even the Liberals, despite how draconian these laws were, still I think we're slightly better than what some other people would have done in this situation, which always sucks to say, because it's like, oh, it could have been worse. But we have to almost sometimes think about that, right? Of, this was where people wanted things to go sometimes. And maybe it was, it was pulled back. It should have been pulled back about 5 steps. Maybe it was only pulled back 1 step. But I think it just goes to show about how ingrained this thought was. And I want to wrap up this kind of part on the residential schools on this Davin report, because the last part of that report is essentially Davin just rambling on about how he thinks about Indigenous people. And I think it's a pretty good idea of kind of how the population in general is thinking. And this is a few quotes here that tells the story really well. He says, the Indian man himself is a noble type of man in a very early stage of development. His temperament is much more part lymphatic, meaning kind of lazy. That temperament might or might not be modified by their advance in civilization in the course of generation. This temperament, unified with the temperament of a Saxon or Celt, a type is produced of great staying power, often highly intellectual, vigorous, and quick perceptions, and a large resource. Basically saying there's hope if we can get them to be like British whites, basically. That's the thought. And he mentions that the Indian is not a child like some would say. So he's saying, hey, they're not children. And he's talking about fully grown adults, but their race is in their childhood stage. It needs to grow up. It needs to be more, like we said, quote unquote, civilized. He even goes on to say there should be the harshest of punishments to anybody who cheats an Indian person, which on the surface, that's great. These people are trying to grow and trying to find their shape in Canada. And if anybody cheats them, they should be punished really hard. But then when you really look at the subtext of that, he's not saying that because he thinks we need to help people because they're trying to grow. It's no, they're just so below where we are from a civilization perspective that it's almost like cheating someone who's lesser than you and who you're taking an easy target, and we should really punish those people. So he just rants on about that kind of stuff for a while, basically saying, it was a mistake to give the guarantees of schools because the chiefs will think they can run it and that kind of stuff. And he kind of foreshadows really well to what ends up happening in Canada. He goes, yeah, I noticed there's this one school that had funding from the church and it lost the funding and it's not in good shape. So Canada needs a better policy around it. But he ultimately comes away with it saying we should use the schools that were already set up by the various Christian groups within Canada, use those schools because it'll help us from a cost perspective and all those sort of things. So that's this report that gets sent up to Sir John A. Macdonald and the conservative government at the time. So I like to think this is kind of a microcosm of how most people are thinking, because if it is, it, I think to me answers the question of how could Sir John A. Macdonald and how could someone who's understands about bringing people together, if this is kind of the baseline, even if he's slightly better than that, it's still very, very off base to where, we would hope that he would get to. So I think that kind of answers that question for me, but my goodness, it was a shocking read. And I recommend if anybody's interested, go give it a read, because there's some really shocking stuff in there. And then there's just a lot of just like more tactical things that are just kind of interesting, but yeah, very, very odd, strange read, but hey, here we are.
Yeah, it's interesting because while you were speaking, I'm kind of reflecting back on just how we were taught about residential schools and like this part of Canadian history. And I think what gets lost is this really skewed paternalism that kind of undercuts almost every relationship that the Canadian government has had with Indigenous communities. This kind of like, you need caretaking approach and we're the ones to provide it for you is something I don't know how unique it is to other examples of this type of kind of, relation between government and Indigenous communities. I'm sure there's similarities across the board, but there's a lot of it in our conversation so far.
It's so weird because sometimes there's like, maybe from like Christian missionaries' perspective, this deep empathy. And we even talked about it with Cortez and the Spanish. I mean, not Cortez himself, but some of the missionaries that were coming, this deep emotional connection to the Indigenous people being like, we're going to make you Christian because it's the right thing to do. And we're going to save you. And we're going to do all of these things. That's just how they're thinking about it. It's not, we're going to exploit these people and take everything away from them like Cortez and a lot of the conquistadors thought. And it's these two sides, but you're right. It's this paternal of, we're going to save you. We're going to get you right, but it's going to be under our control. We don't really care what you have to say. And even if you do, sure, you're a small minority. Oh, you rebelled a little bit. We're going to go and we're going to kick your butts, and do a lot of those sort of things. So yeah, I think it's just this undertone that seems to be here for, like you said, pretty much this whole discussion we've had so far.
Yeah. I think it's probably worthwhile to mention too, I think just based on the report, broader sentiments across Canada at this time about how these policies or kind of viewpoints were landing. And I was able to come up with some, from a social cultural perspective. So I think what I'm walking away with just based on like the last 5 to 10 minutes of the conversation is that this whole idea of assimilation is, at least at a political level, pretty popular, agreed upon from both parties. You don't see that very often. But like at a social level, what are we talking about? And what does that actually look like? And I think here's an obvious one. Indigenous peoples were not very happy with this idea. They faced significant criticism. The government faced significant criticism from Indigenous leaders and communities who saw these policies as, violations to the treaties and attempts to kind of eradicate their culture and autonomy, which in essence, I think, was a goal. But public confidence in assimilation. So we're not talking about Indigenous communities anymore. So we're talking about broader Canadian society. Both English and French speaking peoples generally supported the idea of assimilation, reflecting this kind of widespread belief in this, superiority of the European culture. I use that loosely because, this is the context of the episode, but the belief was, again, shared by politicians across party lines and amongst the general population, minus the Indigenous communities.
Yeah. And I have a great quote from Sir John A. Macdonald in actually 1887. He was speaking to the cabinet at the time. And he said, the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all aspects within the inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit for the change. So I think you're right. Like at a political level, everyone's aligned. French and English are aligned. Like you said, like politicians don't agree on anything, but this was just kind of always seemed like that foregone conclusion of, these Indigenous groups are going to get assimilated into Canadian culture. And that's just the way it's going to be. All of their complaining about, oh, we want this, we want that. Nothing to worry about, because eventually, slowly but surely, by force, by changing of, maybe desperation too, everyone's going to come on board. And to even see it too at a individual level and a regular person type level, how much is Sir John A. Macdonald even really driving this policy other than going with the flow? Because it just seems like that's just what everybody believed for so long. And took a really long time for people to maybe realize that this wasn't the best course of action.
And I think like coincidentally, so That quote's from 1887.
Yeah, 1887.
So that same year, he established the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, the predecessors to the RCMP, to maintain order in the West. And I think throughout this conversation, what I've noticed is that with every kind of tactic to assimilate the Indigenous communities, it starts with the opportunity to enfranchise. It starts with an actual legislative framing. It gets more direct. It gets more forceful. And what's more forceful than the creation of essentially an armed security force to maintain order in a region you're trying to govern?
You're right. It really is the carrot and the stick of, hey, here's an opportunity, voluntary. We'd love to have you. Here's some things we need you to do. If you don't do it, that's fine. You still have time, versus we got police marching around your reserve and making sure that, you're not even, I think it was the pass system that was passed around that time as well, where you weren't allowed to leave the reserve without a pass. And that does come off some violence, from Louis Riel and when he came back to Canada. And so I think it's very clear that, Sir John A. Macdonald is dealing with violence and essentially almost like a wartime type of prime minister. Don't think it's definitely his strong suit. He definitely didn't handle it in the right way. We talk about, using starvation policies around that time. And it's all kind of within this same time period that he's a little bit scared at what's happening in the West, right? Because we've talked about him as this nation maker, right? And trying to keep the glue together. And this is really the first kind of large strife that he's had to deal with from that's even close to rebellion or anything like that. And he doesn't know really how to handle it very well. And I think that's definitely a blemish on him, where he's able to, sit him down in a room with a bunch of politicians, get him to get people voting in the right way. There's very few people that I would want on my side outside of Sir John A. Macdonald. But when I have a rebellion and some civil unrest, I think that's where he loses it a little bit, just based on, what's happening at this time, but also the pressures coming from the Liberal Party as well. The Liberals are even more radical in some sense. And there's a famous thing in the House, I think, where he's actually criticized for not trying to starve the Indigenous groups out enough by the opposition. They're saying you're giving them too much food, and now they're not getting in line in the way that we want them to after this rebellion. So it's just a very, very brutal time, I think, for everybody involved. And how Sir John A. Macdonald fits into all this it's tricky, because he's on one side, you can see him pulling the radicals back a little bit. When the Liberals want to push things in one direction, he sometimes pulls it back. But sometimes when people go too far, kind of puts his hands up and says, yeah, go for it. I sanction this. And I think, that's part of being a politician. But for something that's going to have such a long, lasting impact, it's hard to, again, you can't walk away from this one way or the other, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think any question of legacy around leadership at this point is always so nuanced, because there's so much complexity, right? I think what I can say confidently, to the best of our abilities, is we've tried to paint a very broad view, bring in as many perspectives as we can. And this whole, we focused a lot on Indigenous relations, and it seems like in many ways, Sir John A. was just kind of towing the broader line that had, national agreement on, more or less. Obviously, when you get into specifics, things change, but more or less, there was kind of broad agreement on this is the way we should approach Indigenous relations.
Yeah, he towed the party line, right? I think that's probably the best way to look at it. And I like to think of, if you took Sir John A. Macdonald away from the whole nation making of Canada, would Canada have become a country in the same way that it is today? Maybe, but maybe not. I think maybe more so on the no side, or it may have taken a little bit longer, just because everything you read about him as being such a good politician, be able to unify people, and being ridiculously popular too, with winning a crazy amount of majorities and actually getting French-speaking Canada to actually get behind him as well, which again, at that time was almost unheard of. But if I do look at, if you took Sir John A. Macdonald out of all of these Indigenous policies, what would have happened? I almost see it staying the same, maybe shifting a little bit better, a little bit worse, but I don't really see him as the spearhead around all of this. I think you're right. He probably, if you were to criticize him, did he do enough to stop some of the terrible things that were happening? Probably not. But he also did enough to kind of pull it back from getting a little bit too crazy in some areas. And so, maybe you put in a different figurehead. And I think we've established this, that I hate the whole analogy of, he's just a man of his time, because I think he needs to be more than that. And I think that's how a leader at that time should be, especially someone who's building a nation for the first time. Yeah, but I think, the horses have left the stable, left the gates. It's kind of going out there, and to bring everything back in, I think is a really, really challenging task. But damn, it's unfortunate, because it would be really interesting to, for Canada to be one of the few countries in the world where, outside of maybe New Zealand, is one of the only countries I can think of that actually has somewhat good relations with their Indigenous people. it would have been interesting to see how Canada would have evolved in that sense.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's a closing thought just on this conversation. So the Indian Act came through in, 1867?
76,
76, right?
1876, yeah.
1876. Sir John A. died in 1891, and the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996.
It is still the most mind-blowing thing, I think. Of all the things we've learned in history, that still blows my mind today. Like, we were alive when residential school, well, at least one of them existed, right? Yeah, it's a heck of a legacy to leave, I think, in that sense, because there's people who, remember this happening, who are still dealing with this today. But I think even with Sir John A. Macdonald, like there was, some glimmer of hope with him. I have a quote here from him where he wrote to a friend of his who was a chief, an Ojibwe chief in the Mississauga area. And he says, "I hope to see someday the Indian race represented by one of themselves on the floor of the House of Commons." He wrote to a friend. So, he's, I think, understanding and maybe a little bit more, I won't say respectful, but just understanding and sympathetic to the situation. But I still think, he's probably falling in the same realm of, becoming a British person with Indigenous blood is important to him. But it's a heck of a legacy. And I can see why when we talked about this at the beginning of how does his legacy, why is it so controversial today? There's a lot here. And, we study a lot of history. We've seen a lot of things and we did, we've read a lot about him. There's a 0% chance anybody can come away from a conversation about Sir John A. Macdonald saying he's objectively good or objectively bad, or he's a genocidal maniac, or, one of the greatest people that, Canada should be on their knees thanking him for all the great things that he did. You can have two things be true at the same time.
Yep. And I think that's what most of history comes down to.
It really does. I don't think, there's very few people we've walked away from saying they're this or that. So, I really enjoyed this conversation. So, I think this is going to wrap up our time with Canadian history, and we're going to do something else. We're not sure yet, but stay tuned for another episode in a couple weeks.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.